The sun hung low over the wide desert, and the early heat spread slowly across the empty road as Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock drove toward their quiet weekend escape. They wanted a calm break away from crowded places, and the long desert highway felt like the perfect path where no one expected anything from them. Yet both of them sensed something unusual ahead, something that made the air feel heavier than usual, and they kept glancing at the horizon as if waiting for something to appear. Sandra leaned forward when she noticed strange marks in the sand near the trail. The marks looked messy and uneven, almost like bikes dragged across the ground in a hurry. Keanu slowed the car because her eyes always caught the smallest signs, and he trusted her judgment. The desert was dangerous for anyone traveling alone, and even a small problem could turn serious under the rising heat. The silence around them made the scene feel even more unsettling, and they exchanged a look filled with concern before stepping out of the car. The heat wrapped around them instantly, and Sandra shielded her eyes while examining the dusty ground. Two bikes stood abandoned a few steps away from the road, both tilted and covered with sand like they had been dropped during a sudden moment. Keanu touched one of the handlebars and noticed it was still warm, which meant the bikes were not waiting there for long. Something forced the riders to leave in a hurry, and that thought made Sandra's heart tighten with worry. There were footprints near the bikes, but they looked unsteady and scattered like the people walking were exhausted or frightened. The tracks moved deeper into the open desert toward a rocky valley. Keanu grabbed 2 water bottles and told Sandra they needed to follow the prints before the heat erased them completely. She agreed without hesitation because she felt a strong pull inside her chest, the kind she felt only when someone nearby truly needed help. They followed the trail slowly, watching how the footprints grew lighter as the sand shifted under the wind. The valley ahead looked dry and lonely, and Sandra whispered that the riders must have been desperate to walk that far without shade. Keanu kept scanning the area until he saw something small lying near a rock. It was a torn piece from a backpack, dusty, but clearly dropped recently. Sandra felt a sharp fear rise inside her because every sign pointed to someone struggling for survival. As they stepped deeper into the valley, the heat shimmered like waves across the sand. Keanu suddenly stopped and stared toward a distant rock formation where a faint shape leaned against the stone. Sandra followed his gaze, and her breath caught in her throat when she realized it was a person. They rushed forward with careful steps, calling softly so they would not startle whoever was there. When they reached the figure, Sandra fell to her knees. It was a teenage girl with dry lips and trembling hands. Her breathing was weak, and her eyes opened only halfway when Sandra touched her shoulder gently. Keanu gave her small sips of water, and the girl held the bottle like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Sandra asked her what happened, and the girl whispered in a weak and broken voice. She said she was not alone. She said someone else was still out there. She said he could not move anymore. Keanu and Sandra froze as the girl lifted her shaking hand and pointed deeper into the valley, toward the darkest part where the sun barely reached. Her voice trembled as she whispered the words that made their hearts drop. She said the other person was not breathing when she last saw him, and then the girl collapsed against Sandra's arm. Keanu felt the girl grow lighter in Sandra's arms as her strength faded, and a wave of worry washed through him because they had no idea how long she had been out in the heat. Sandra held the girl close while calling her softly, hoping she would stay awake just a little longer. Her voice carried both fear and tenderness, and Keanu could see the tension in her eyes as she tried to comfort the trembling teenager. The desert heat pressed harder now, and every second felt heavier as they realized the danger surrounding them. Keanu opened another water bottle and placed it beside Sandra before turning his attention toward the direction the girl had pointed. The valley stretched far into rough, uneven paths that looked darker and more unforgiving, and a faint shadow flickered between the rocks as the wind shifted. The girl's last words repeated inside his mind, and they felt like a warning that pushed him forward. Sandra watched him stand, and she knew exactly what he was thinking even before he spoke. His voice stayed low but steady when he said they could not leave the other person alone out there. Sandra gently placed the girl in a slightly shaded spot near a tall rock where the heat seemed less intense. She checked the girl's pulse again and felt relieved when she felt a soft but steady beat. She told Keanu she would stay with the girl and try to keep her conscious, and Keanu nodded before taking a careful step toward the deeper part of the valley. The wind brushed against his face like a dry breath, and the silence around him felt almost too quiet, as if the desert was holding its secrets inside the shifting sand. Keanu moved slowly while scanning every corner of the valley. He studied the ground and noticed faint drag marks mixed with footprints. The marks looked heavy and uneven, like someone had been pulling something or struggling to walk. The sight made his chest tighten with unease because the marks told a painful story without words. He followed them carefully, feeling the heat growing stronger with each step as the valley walls narrowed around him. The rocky walls blocked most of the breeze, and the air felt trapped and suffocating. Behind him, Sandra kept speaking gently to the girl, asking her simple questions to keep her awake. The girl whispered her name, Lena, and Sandra repeated it softly to help her stay alert. Lena tried to speak more, but her voice broke as she explained that she and her older brother had been biking through the desert to visit a family friend. She said they got lost when their GPS failed, and then her brother collapsed after hours under the burning sun. Each word came out slowly like it cost her strength, and Sandra held her hand gently to calm her. Meanwhile, Keanu pushed deeper into the narrow path where the sunlight faded into a cooler shade. His eyes focused on every small detail, and his footsteps stayed steady even when the path grew uneven under him. He noticed a piece of cloth caught on a sharp rock and recognized it as the same fabric from Lena's torn backpack. The sight sent a jolt through him, and he moved faster while calling out softly in case the brother could hear him. The path twisted around a large boulder, and Keanu felt a rush of cold fear when he heard a faint sound ahead. It was not a voice, but something like a weak shuffle or a rough breath carried by the wind. He followed the sound until he reached a shadowed corner where the ground dipped slightly. He took a step forward and saw a figure lying on the sand, half hidden by the rock. The person looked older than Lena, maybe 16 or 17, and his arms were curled tightly against his chest, as if trying to protect himself from something he could not fight. Keanu rushed toward him and knelt beside the boy, calling out softly while checking for signs of life. The boy's skin felt burning hot, and his breathing was shallow. Keanu quickly gave him slow, careful sips of water while supporting his head. The boy opened his eyes for a brief moment, and Keanu saw a deep fear inside them. The boy tried to speak, but only managed a few weak words about not wanting to leave his sister alone. Keanu reassured him with a calm, steady voice, promising they had found her and she was safe. The boy's expression softened slightly, but his body still trembled with exhaustion. Then suddenly the boy grabbed Keanu's wrist with surprising strength and whispered something that made Keanu freeze. He said they were not the only ones in this valley. He said someone else had been watching them since morning, and then his eyes closed again. Keanu stayed completely still for a moment as the boy's trembling hand slipped from his wrist and fell softly onto the sand. The valley air felt colder even though the sun still burned above them, and a chill ran through his spine when the boy's words echoed again inside his head. Someone else was out here, someone watching, someone neither he nor Sandra had seen. The thought mixed with the silence around him, turning the valley into something darker and more unsettling than before. He checked the boy's breathing again and felt relieved when he sensed a faint, steady rhythm. The boy needed water and shade, and he needed to be moved soon. Keanu lifted him carefully, supporting his weight so he would not struggle. With every step back toward Sandra, Keanu kept looking over his shoulder, scanning the corners of the rocks and the distant ridge lines. The valley felt too quiet now, almost like it was listening to his movements. His instincts sharpened, and every sound made him feel the presence the boy had warned him about. Sandra saw them approaching and quickly positioned the girl so she could help the brother lie beside her. She gasped softly at how weak he looked, and she placed her hand gently on his forehead while speaking to him with warm, calm words. Keanu explained what happened and repeated the boy's warning in a steady, low voice, so Lena would not panic. Sandra looked around with growing unease because she trusted Keanu's instincts, and the idea of someone watching them made her heart beat faster. The boy opened his eyes again for a moment and whispered something to Lena that made tears rise in her eyes. She hugged his arm lightly as she told him they were safe now, and Sandra laid a towel between them and the burning sand to keep their bodies cooler. The heat grew stronger with each passing minute, and the valley around them felt tighter and more dangerous. They needed to move, but Keanu knew they could not rush without hurting the injured siblings. Keanu walked around the area to check the surroundings while Sandra comforted the children. He studied the high rocks and uneven paths, searching for footprints or signs of movement. He noticed a small trail of sand that looked disturbed near the ridge, like someone had stepped there recently. The prints were faint but long, and the depth suggested an adult with a heavier build. Keanu crouched and traced the edge of the footprint with his fingertips before standing straight again, more alert than before. When he returned to Sandra, she whispered that Lena mentioned seeing a shadowy figure earlier in the morning before she collapsed. Lena said she believed it was someone passing by, but the fear in her voice showed she was not fully sure. Sandra squeezed the girl's hand and promised nothing would happen now that they were with them, and Keanu nodded in agreement, although he kept looking toward the rocks. Something about the valley felt wrong, and he did not want to risk staying longer than necessary. The siblings needed shade and real medical care, and Keanu knew that getting them to the car was the first priority. He and Sandra prepared to lift the boy slowly while letting Lena walk with support. The short distance to the car felt much longer now with the weight of the warning hanging over them. The wind moved softly, carrying a faint rustling sound that made Sandra freeze for a moment. Keanu turned quickly toward the sound with sharp eyes, feeling a sudden surge of tension through his body. The rustling stopped instantly, almost as if whoever caused it realized they had been heard. Keanu stepped slightly in front of Sandra and the children, scanning the rocks with a steady, controlled breath. He told Sandra to start walking slowly toward the car while he followed close behind. Sandra nodded, helping Lena up carefully while Keanu supported the boy. Every step felt heavy and cautious, like walking through a place that hid secrets beneath every stone. They reached the open area near the bend of the valley, and the car came into view in the distance. Sandra felt a small wave of relief until Keanu suddenly raised his hand, signaling her to stop. She froze immediately because she recognized that signal from him, and she trusted it without question. His eyes narrowed toward something on the sand a few steps ahead. There were new footprints, fresh ones, deeper than the earlier tracks, and they led directly toward their car. Keanu's voice dropped into a tense whisper as he told Sandra not to move forward, because someone had reached their car before they did. The moment Keanu saw the fresh footprints leading straight to their car, a heavy tension spread across the valley like a cold shadow. Sandra felt her heart tighten as she followed his gaze, and she instinctively held Lena a little closer while trying to keep her own fear hidden. The injured boy leaned weakly against Keanu, and even in his exhausted state, he sensed the sudden shift in the air. The footprints were deep and clear, and they were not from any of them. They were from someone strong, someone moving with purpose, someone who reached the car before they did. Keanu motioned for Sandra to stay behind him while he adjusted his grip on the boy. His voice stayed calm when he told her to keep her focus on the children and to move slowly when he said so. Sandra nodded while taking a deep, steady breath because she trusted him completely, and she knew that panic would only make things worse. The wind brushed across the sand, carrying small grains that shimmered under the sun, and every shifting sound made her flinch slightly. She held Lena's hand firmly and whispered gentle words to keep her calm. Keanu studied the footprints carefully. They circled around the car, stopping near the doors before moving toward the open desert again. He crouched to examine them more closely and noticed the shape of the sole was worn and uneven, like an old boot. He also saw that the footprints were fresh because the edges were still sharp and not softened by the wind. The realization made him tense even more because it meant the stranger could still be close, maybe even watching from behind the rocks or dunes. Sandra looked around nervously and whispered that they needed to reach the car quickly because the children could not stay under the heat much longer. Keanu agreed, but he needed to be sure the stranger was not waiting near the car or planning something dangerous. He scanned the area again, focusing on the tall rocks and the empty road. Everything looked silent but not peaceful, and that made him feel even more cautious. He helped the boy lean against a rock for support before taking a few careful steps toward the car. The siblings watched him with fearful eyes, and Sandra held their trembling hands gently. The valley felt larger suddenly, like the shadows stretched farther, and Sandra felt an uneasiness inside that refused to fade. Keanu reached halfway to the car when he suddenly stopped and raised one hand again. Sandra's breath caught in her throat because she knew that gesture meant something was wrong. Keanu bent slightly and picked something off the sand, holding it between his fingers as he studied it under the sunlight. It was a small piece of metal, bent and scratched, like a tool or a part of a broken device. He turned it around slowly and realized it was a piece of a torn belt buckle. The leather was dry and cracked, and the metal had a strange smell that suggested it had been exposed to intense heat. Sandra saw his expression grow more serious and asked if everything was fine. Keanu did not answer immediately because he was piecing together details in his mind. The abandoned bikes, the footprints, the warning from the boy, and now a torn buckle near their car. Nothing felt like an accident anymore. He walked closer to the car, his body tense and prepared for anything. He checked the ground again and noticed that the sand near the trunk looked disturbed, as if someone stood there for a while. He leaned down to look under the car, but saw nothing except a few rocks and drifting sand. He slowly opened the door, expecting something unusual, but everything inside looked untouched. The bottles, the seats, and the bags were exactly where they had left them. Yet the feeling of being watched grew heavier, almost suffocating. Sandra called out softly, asking if it was safe. Keanu turned to answer her when something caught his eye. A small dark shape peeked from behind a distant boulder near the curve of the valley. It moved slightly when the wind changed direction. Keanu's heartbeat quickened because it was too far to identify, but its presence was unmistakable. Sandra followed his gaze and felt a chill crawl across her skin. Keanu whispered urgently for Sandra to bring the children closer because they needed to leave immediately. But before she could take a single step, the dark shape shifted again. And this time, it stood up. The dark shape rose slowly behind the distant boulder, and the moment it stood upright, the air around the valley felt heavy and tight. Sandra held Lena close while the boy leaned weakly against her side, and both children stared wide-eyed at the tall figure that watched them from across the sand. Keanu stepped a little in front of his group without thinking, and his posture changed instantly, shifting into a protective stance that came naturally when danger appeared. Sandra felt her heartbeat pounding inside her chest, yet she kept her voice steady as she whispered to the children that everything would be all right. The figure did not move closer at first. It stood still with a strange, rigid posture as if studying them carefully. The distance made it difficult to see details, but Keanu noticed the man looked thin and tired, with uneven shoulders that suggested he carried a heavy load. He also seemed older, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s, and the way he shifted his weight showed exhaustion. Yet something unsettled Keanu deeply because the man's presence did not feel random. He had been near their car. He had followed the siblings, and he had remained hidden until now. The wind swept across the valley and carried a faint scratchy sound toward them, like a rough cough or a dry breath, and Sandra tightened her grip on the boy's arm. Lena whispered fearfully and asked if the man had hurt them earlier, but Sandra gently ran her hand through the girl's hair and told her nothing bad would happen now. She hoped her words sounded more confident than she felt because the valley no longer felt like a safe place. The heat still burned, and their shadows stretched long across the sand as if marking a dangerous moment in time. Keanu raised his voice slightly to call out to the stranger, asking if he was all right and if he needed help. His tone stayed calm and steady, and the man shifted his stance when he heard it. The stranger took one slow step forward, and Keanu noticed his boots were worn and cracked, matching the footprint he examined earlier. The man lifted his hand as if trying to wave, but the movement was weak and shaky. Keanu stepped forward carefully while keeping Sandra and the children behind him. He told the man they had water and could help him if he was injured or lost. The stranger opened his mouth as if to answer, but only a strained whisper came out. He tried again, taking another slow step forward. His voice reached them faintly, carried by the wind, and Sandra felt her breath catch when she heard the trembling words. The man said he had been trying to help the siblings earlier but collapsed from exhaustion. He said he tried to stay near the road but became disoriented when the heat grew stronger. He apologized repeatedly while his voice cracked, and Sandra felt a heavy ache in her chest because his tone carried deep regret rather than aggression. Keanu observed him closely, trying to understand the truth behind his words. The man seemed genuinely weak and confused, and his trembling hands made Keanu realize he had been struggling alone for hours. The man explained that he found the siblings wandering and tried to bring them closer to shade, but collapsed near the car. He said he feared leaving the area because he thought help might pass by eventually. Sandra's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she felt relief mixing with sadness because the man looked like he had been fighting his own battle against the desert. Keanu moved a little closer, offering a bottle of water by placing it on a flat rock halfway between them. The man approached slowly, almost stumbling, and grabbed the bottle with shaking fingers. He drank carefully and wiped his dry mouth before whispering a soft thank you. Keanu asked him if he had a phone or any supplies, but the man shook his head with tired eyes. He said his bag was stolen 2 nights ago when he camped near an abandoned rest stop, and he had no way to call for help. Sandra and the children stepped forward slowly, and Lena looked at the man with gentle concern rather than fear now. The boy tried to speak to the stranger, thanking him for trying to help earlier, and the man lowered his head as if he struggled to hold back his emotions. The moment felt calmer for a breath of time, and Sandra felt a small sense of hope return. But then Keanu glanced toward the car again and noticed something that made his stomach twist. The trunk was slightly open, and none of them had left it that way. Keanu walked toward it quickly with rising tension in his chest, and Sandra followed behind him with the siblings. He reached the trunk and slowly lifted it the rest of the way. Inside the trunk, hidden under a blanket, he found something that did not belong to any of them. A large black bag with dried mud and torn straps. And then he realized the stranger was no longer behind them. Keanu stared at the black bag lying inside the trunk, and a cold wave ran through his chest because the bag looked old and damaged, and it clearly belonged to someone who had been wandering the desert for a long time. Sandra reached his side and asked softly what he found, and when she saw the bag, her worried expression deepened. Lena and her brother watched with nervous eyes, and the silence around them grew heavier when Keanu realized the stranger had disappeared from his spot behind them. Sandra turned quickly to look over her shoulder, searching the valley, but the stranger was nowhere in sight. The desert looked completely still again, almost too still, and that sudden emptiness made her pulse race. Keanu scanned the rocks and dunes with sharp focus as he helped the children step closer together. The man had been weak and exhausted, yet somehow he moved away without leaving a single sound behind. The situation felt unsettling, and Keanu tightened his jaw as he prepared himself for whatever came next. He slowly unzipped the black bag while Sandra stood close, ready to shield the children if needed. Inside the bag he found worn clothes, a broken flashlight, a few empty water bottles, and a small notebook with pages covered in shaky handwriting. He opened the notebook carefully and read a few lines written in rough pen strokes. The words described a man who had been traveling alone after losing his job and home, trying to cross different towns in search of work. The notebook also described how he found the siblings wandering in the desert and tried to save them before collapsing from dehydration. The more Keanu read, the heavier his heart felt. The man had been living in survival mode for weeks, fighting hunger and heat without proper supplies. He tried to help strangers even when he had nothing for himself. Sandra felt tears rise slowly as she realized the man was not a threat at all. He was a desperate soul holding on to the last pieces of hope he had left. The children watched quietly, and Lena whispered softly that she wished they had found him sooner. Just then a weak voice echoed behind them. Sandra turned and saw the stranger standing a little distance away, leaning heavily against a rock. He looked ashamed and scared, and his voice trembled when he explained why he stepped away. He said he thought they would be angry when they saw the bag, because he feared they might assume he was dangerous. He said he became afraid of being misunderstood, so he backed away to avoid frightening the children. His words pierced the quiet air, filled with regret and exhaustion. Keanu approached him slowly, raising both hands in a gentle, calming gesture. He told the man that no one was angry and that they were grateful for what he tried to do for the siblings. Sandra stepped beside Keanu and nodded with warm understanding, telling the man he was safe with them. The man tried to speak again, but his knees gave out, and Keanu rushed forward to catch him before he fell. Sandra called the children closer as Keanu supported the man's weight with steady arms. They brought him to the shade near the car and gave him careful sips of water. The man's breathing slowed, and for the first time his face looked peaceful rather than frightened. Keanu told Sandra they needed to leave the desert quickly and get everyone medical attention. She agreed immediately, helping Lena and her brother into the backseat while Keanu helped the stranger into the passenger seat. The man tried to say thank you, but Keanu stopped him gently and told him they were all safe now. As they drove across the long desert road, Sandra kept glancing at the siblings who were finally resting with calmer breaths. Keanu looked at the stranger who sat quietly with tears forming in his tired eyes. The man whispered that he thought the world had forgotten him, but today reminded him that kindness still existed even in the worst places. Sandra reached forward and placed her hand over his, telling him that hope always finds its way back when people care for each other. The drive continued under the warm sun, but now the desert felt different. The silence no longer felt threatening. It felt like it was holding a story that changed everyone who walked through it. Keanu and Sandra exchanged a soft look filled with relief and deep emotion, knowing they had saved 3 lives that day, but also knowing those 3 lives had changed them as well. When they finally reached the highway, Lena whispered something from the backseat. She said she would never forget the two strangers who found them when the world felt lost. Sandra smiled with tears in her eyes, and Keanu reached back with a gentle touch on her shoulder. And the desert behind them stayed quiet, carrying a story that would one day bring millions to tears.